Okay, so I'll start. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our program this evening on why did Russia invade Ukraine? We all have many questions, I'm sure, on why this is happening and what is behind the historically and politically. I'm Ann Nicol, Executive Director at the United Nations Association of New York, and I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Elise Giuliano, a professor of political science at Columbia University. She directs the program on U.S. Russian Relations at the Harriman Institute, and she is also a director of graduate studies for Harriman Institute's MA program. Her research focuses on the intersection of politics and identity and the determinants of popular opinion. Her award-winning book, Constructing Grievance, Ethnic Nationalism in Russia's Republics, examines minority support for nationalist separatism in Russia's ethnic republics. She has done fieldwork, research in Kiev and Kharkiv in the Ukraine, and has published on the origins of support for separatism in Donetsk and Luhansk. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. Welcome, Dr. Giuliano.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak to the UN Association this evening. 12 days ago, Russia launched an unprovoked, full-scale invasion against the independent sovereign state of Ukraine. This war represents a massive escalation of a war that Russia began 8 years ago in 2014, when Russia annexed the Ukrainian region of Crimea and started a war in the Ukrainian region of Donbass in Ukraine's eastern part of the country. As we in the West watch this tragedy unfold on our screens and on our social media feeds, we unfortunately must recognize the classic words of the ancient Greek philosopher Thucydides: the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. We should also recognize, however, that this is a war against democracy. Ukraine is a democracy, while Russia, of course, is an authoritarian state, and one whose leader has always been deeply afraid of popular protest and afraid of what the example of popular protest on the border of Ukraine would mean for the population of Russia. The outcome and the consequences of this war are deeply significant, therefore, not only for the millions of people directly involved, of course, not only for the regional security of Eurasia and the Black Sea region, not only for Europe more broadly, which is now experiencing an influx of 1.7 war refugees, but for all democratic states and for the principle of democracy. Will the democratic world and will the US allow the so-called militarily strong to destroy sovereign states and to dictate terms to Europe and the West? It's a question we must ask ourselves as Americans begin to feel the effects of this war, if only felt in the sphere of rising gas prices, which of course is an order of magnitude less terrifying than what Ukrainians are experiencing for the past 12 days. So I'd like to begin with the personal. Last week, almost a week after the war began, I received a Facebook message in the middle of the night from my friend and colleague in the city of Kharkiv asking for help. There are Grad missiles raining down on us and they don't stop, she said. And she asked me to lobby for an international humanitarian convoy to extract women and children from the city. She added, we don't trust a Russian corridor, even if Russia does agree to establish one, which they hadn't at that time. And as we see now, a few days later, that was a correct assessment since Russia has fired on, some soldiers have fired on individuals, Ukrainian citizens leaving through the humanitarian corridor. So I tweeted and I posted on Facebook, tried to get the message out. Several days later, I heard that she made it to a neighboring city a few hours away from the besieged city of Kharkiv. Many hours of worrying later and a few more days, I heard she made it to Poland. Since then, I've heard from other friends in Kharkiv who've remained within Ukraine as internally displaced people or IDPs, but moving or trying to move to safer cities in the western regions of Ukraine outside of the direct attack of Russian forces. But now at the same time, very tragically, I see other Ukrainian friends and colleagues on Facebook starting to post announcements of their friends and colleagues who have been killed. But here in the West, we just have to turn on CNN to learn about innocents killed for no reason. The shocking degree of aggression and violence, combined with the intentional targeting of civilians, the large number of casualties on both sides will have enormous yet unpredictable consequences for the international state system and for the post-Cold War era. Europe and the United States have presented a united front in support of Ukraine and against Russia, of course. Europe and the US have imposed harsh economic sanctions, which has caused the ruble to free fall. A lot of Western businesses have exited Russia more and more each day. We just heard about Shell today. And individual Russians and Russia as a country has been expelled from sports organizations, especially European sports organizations and cultural institutions. So why did Russia invade Ukraine? How did it come to this? Why did it seem to catch so many people by surprise, both in the West and in Ukraine? Since November, Russian military was arrayed along the northern and eastern border of Ukraine, and the Biden administration and leaders in France and Germany engaged in increasingly frantic shuttle diplomacy throughout January and February. Then the Biden administration began releasing what it knew, what it was aware of from intelligence reports about Russia's plans, which was a rather successful strategy designed to delay Russia's attack and to prevent Russia from monopolizing the information space about what was happening with Ukraine, as it had during the crisis of 2014. Yet in the lead up to the war, even the president of Ukraine was telling the population to remain calm and seemingly not preparing people for the high probability of war. And I can also attest that talking to some friends in Ukraine at the time, a lot of people just did not believe it was possible. Nobody wanted to believe that this degree of violence and aggression and frankly inhumanity was possible. So why did Russia invade and why now? What can explain the timing? I just want to quickly go through a few possible reasons that have to do with Putin and Russia's foreign policy establishment's long list of grievances against the US and against the West and Europe more generally. And then I will focus in on a more Ukraine-centered explanation. So as you may remember, just recently, back in December, Putin initially presented a set of demands to the West, asking the West to reconsider the European security architecture, i.e. NATO, basically to roll back Europe to the map of 1991, when the Soviet Union had just collapsed and when the Baltic states and all of the former satellite states of Eastern Europe had not yet become NATO members. They also asked that NATO should not expand further. In other words, that Ukraine should remain neutral, even though NATO membership was not even on the table for Ukraine. It was officially not on the table. Ukrainian leaders had been wanting to enter NATO for a while, but NATO was not inviting, and it wasn't possible due to the ongoing low-level war that began in 2014 in Donbass. However, due to the fallout from the war in Donbass and due to the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Ukraine had, of course, been moving westward and had become closer to the EU and much closer in particular to the US, especially in terms of military training that Ukraine had been receiving from the US. So one set of explanations for why Russia began the war focuses on Russia's attempt to gain concessions from the West, an attempt that we now see as one that's gone awry for Russia. The military forces, though, at the time in December and even in January and in February, a raid on Ukraine's border looked to many observers like an effort to compel the US to stop NATO expansion and to back away from the potential incorporation of Ukraine into NATO and into Europe. This kind of set of explanations sees Putin as primarily concerned with foreign policy. And it sees Putin as attempting to either establish a 19th century type sphere of influence sphere of interest in the countries surrounding Russia, especially in the post-Soviet states that gained their independence in 1991. And some people believe it was that Putin is even interested in reestablishing the Soviet empire. Not a position I agree with, but it's pretty clear that a sphere of influence in the states surrounding Russia is very much something that Putin has been aiming for. Some people go so far as to even ask themselves whether 19th century sphere of influence makes sense, and even make the argument that, you know, the U.S. used to have a sphere of influence, and they even buy into this principle that great power states should have the right to ignore the sovereignty of weaker states. In other words, might makes right. The Thucydides statement that I referred to at the beginning. So in this story, Ukraine is a pawn in the geopolitical competition taking place between the US and Europe on one side and Russia on the other. A more personalistic explanation tied to Putin has to do with Putin's state of mind. People are arguing that he's maybe, lost his mind, that he's addled by COVID, thinking in things in a different way since he's been alone in a bunker for so long. And we use the term bunker metaphorically here, but because during COVID, Putin would not see many people. He kept himself isolated. People had to go through a long protocol just to be near him. There's even rumors that he's not vaccinated. And this type of isolation may have affected how he thinks about things, and especially affects the fact that we know that he has excluded a broader set of advisors from the way he used to operate, when he would hear from different kinds of advisors, and now is almost exclusively listening to the security services, i.e. the FSB, successor to the KGB, military, or military intelligence. Now, certainly Russia and Putin in particular had been nursing a host of grievances against Europe and the US, stretching back to the start of his first presidency in 2000. And if you think about that in combination with this possibility that he is not thinking as rationally or as pragmatically as he used to, then we do make some progress toward understanding the timing of this attack. There are other more proximate reasons that we might identify to explain the timing, and I think these play a role as well. The first one would be how, I think this is quite important, how the Russian security establishment and Putin views the rest of the world. First, starting with the US. They view the US as polarized and in disarray as a result of Trump presidency, as a result of the ease of interfering in the elections, and as a result, frankly, of January 6th. No matter what else you think about January 6th, if you try to think of it from the point of view of foreign observers, and in particular Putin, watching an armed insurrection at the moment that it was happening, I said to my husband, I think this is a threat to national security in the very present moment, because enemies of the US could try to take advantage of this. But I hadn't thought about the fact that it helped form the perceptions of adversary states, and in particular Putin and his team. Another more proximate development is what happened in Afghanistan. There's two parts to this. The first part has to do with the US pullout. Yes, the US pulled out. We won't go into all of the reasons for that pullout or how it was executed, which can be shared across administrations. There's enough blame to go around. But from the point of view of Putin, again, it made the US look weak. But also, the Kremlin was observing what was happening domestically within Afghanistan, and observed how easy it was for the Taliban to basically roll into the capital and Ashraf Ghani, the leader of Afghanistan, to leave quickly without a fight. So it was a relatively peaceful, if you could call it that, without a lot of armed resistance to the Taliban. And that maybe have gone a good way toward forming Putin's perception that he might get away with the same thing in Ukraine. Also, perceptions of Europe. Europe in disarray. Germany had a new chancellor. The UK had pulled out of the EU. European states concerned with their re-election. The fact of the split between, or the split between Europe and the US that was fomented by the Trump administration. All of this looked to Kremlin observers like the West was in decline. And they were starting to make the argument, it's better to get Ukraine now back into the fold, so to speak, than wait in the future, especially if Ukraine strengthens this kind of military relationship with the US. And I know this is something they were thinking because we had some at Columbia University, and in particular, I had an academic guest visit via Zoom, and they would articulate arguments not so much about Ukraine or what future Russian foreign policy, but articulate arguments about the West in decline. And this is definitely how they saw the US, and in particular, how they saw the US. And they would reference what happened during Trump, January 6th, and so on. So it's not, this is not an abstract idea. You could hear it echoing through the Russian foreign policy establishment. So without discounting the importance of these explanations, I want to center my talk today on developing an explanation that centers on Ukraine, because at this point, it's rather clear that this conflict is fundamentally about Ukraine. Basically, I want to emphasize Putin in particular's deep-seated idea that Ukraine is not a sovereign state. And again, that this is an idea shared by many in the foreign policy establishment, though, of course, I'm talking about the government here, the Kremlin, not about the Russian population. So they see 1991, the moment when Ukraine acquired independence, as the original sin, meaning many leaders in Russia did not expect Ukraine and the Ukrainian population to want to become independent of whatever state was sort of forming as the Soviet Union collapsed. Initially, the Soviet Union, when they had the referendum, when Ukraine held a referendum in 1991, and later it became the Russian Federation. So in this talk, I will try to explain the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, the history of that relationship, and Putin's current perception of Ukraine, the Ukrainian population, and its political leaders, especially in the lead up to this war. So Putin, as I've been suggesting, believed this would be an easy and victorious war, and that Russia would be welcomed by parts of the population there, especially by those cities in eastern Ukraine. Why? Now, as you may have heard, much of Ukraine is Russian speaking. It's also Ukrainian speaking, and more as the years proceed after 1991. And Ukrainian language is taught and learned by the younger generations. So we have almost a fully bilingual population, but still some cities in the eastern part of Ukraine are quite Russian speaking. And Ukraine is diverse, you could say, in terms of the ethnic identity of its population. And there are people who continue to identify as ethnic Russians, as well as ethnic Ukrainians. That may not make a lot of sense to some members of our audience, and it's basically a legacy of the Soviet Union in which people had to kind of were identified by their personal ethnicity or nationality in their domestic passport. Some of those identities have remained, but what has also happened, and this will be a big theme of my talk, or one point that I want to emphasize, is that over time, since 1991, Ukrainian national identity, let's call it civic national identity, has strengthened. And this is something that Putin has not realized and is kind of thinking about Ukraine as if it's 1991. Another reason that I'll emphasize for the error of Russia, that Russia made in understanding Ukraine, is this idea of Ukraine divided or polarized between the East and the West. And here, I think the Kremlin relied on polls that showed Ukrainians over time as having different political opinions, especially with regard to supporting NATO or entering the EU, and did not understand how to interpret those polls, which have been changing especially since 2014, since the crisis in Ukraine and since the annexation of Crimea and war in Donbass. And this is what my research has focused on, public opinion in Ukraine and how it's been affected by the crisis in Ukraine since 2014. In addition to public opinion about political issues, though, the Kremlin, it turns out, we just learned, did its own polling. So Ukraine has a very robust set of civic organizations that engage in public opinion polling, which the Kremlin could easily observe and probably did, but also seems to have contracted the FSB, again, successor to the KGB, to do its own polling. And that polling showed that many Ukrainians before the war, were disaffected with politics. It showed declining popularity rating of President Zelensky there, as well as some other points that I'll bring up in a few minutes. And it looks like the Kremlin interpreted these polls to mean that they would be welcomed by a disaffected Ukrainian population, many of whom they interpreted to be sympathetic to Russia, especially those in the East. And so they begin, by trying to take the city of Kharkiv and entering through the north or through the eastern and southern part of the region, which is also part of the region where there has been there have been political attitudes that the Kremlin perceived as more sympathetic to Russia. So that's wrong. And they basically made a huge mistake in understanding how a population reacts when faced with decimation and unmitigated violence and violence against civilians. And it looks pretty clear at this point that the Russian military is intentionally targeting civilians. So, and this just circles back to, the point that I want to make about rising loyalty to the Ukrainian state among the vast majority of Ukrainians. So in making this argument, I'll be presenting a bit of a portrait of Ukraine, a bit of a sketch of popular opinion there. And this portrait, I think, is being brought to life by the tenacity and indeed the bravery of the Ukrainian population as they defend their country. And more broadly and more theoretically, it raises questions for how leaders use and interpret or misinterpret opinion polls, how they often do not account for change, or how they don't really understand the political context in which to interpret opinion polling. Okay, so I'm going to back up a little bit to some Ukrainian history quite quickly. I'm going to start in the Soviet era. Ukraine was not an independent state before 1991, although after the Bolshevik Revolution, it was starting, like many states in East Central Europe, to find intellectuals there were starting to articulate, well, they started before 1918, to articulate a sense of national identity. And Ukraine, during this 4-year violent period of civil war, political authority had gone back and forth between Germans and Soviets. And basically, by 1922, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was formed by the Soviets and by the Bolsheviks in Moscow. And they set up the first capital, by the way, not of the Ukrainian Republic, in Kharkiv, not in Kiev. And Ukraine was one of the most critical, largest republics for the Soviet Union. And Carlos, I suppose you can show a map at this point. The first map just sort of shows that I have on my slides, just sort of shows where Ukraine is in Europe and how it's on the edge of the Soviet Union. And the second map shows the size of, I have a few maps that show the size of the large size of Ukraine. Ukraine was a breadbasket for the Soviet Union, was also an industrial center for the Soviet Union, and its leadership, being Slavs and having many cultural similarities to the Russian leaders of the Soviet Union, were highly incorporated into the Soviet leadership. Many of the leaders of the Soviet Union were ethnic Ukrainian, or for example, Brezhnev was not, but he was born in Ukraine. Khrushchev was raised in Ukraine. Many of the Ukrainian leaders made their careers in the critical industrial regions of Ukraine. and Ukraine was given by the Bolsheviks, who believed in gathering the political sympathies and loyalties of the ethnically different and culturally different populations that existed within the former Russian Empire and then within the Soviet Union. It believed in kind of gaining their loyalty by giving these ethnic republics and people within them a degree of, let's not say political autonomy, but let's say a degree of cultural freedom and linguistic freedom. So they actually the Bolsheviks funded the education, the rationalization, standardization of Ukrainian language, allowed Ukrainian language to be taught, funded Ukrainian culture. But all that came to an end with Stalin in the early 1930s, when he implemented basically Russification and suppressed Ukrainian culture. This is a sad story for Ukrainian culture, for Ukrainian language. And there's a lot to be said there, but I'm going to fast forward to the end of the Soviet period, when we started to see this process during Glasnost and Gorbachev of national revival happening in many of the ethnic republics of the Soviet Union, not least Ukraine. And Ukraine formed a group of intellectuals, formed a national movement there, an opposition movement to the communists named Ruch. And soon it grew. It enjoyed a pretty wide support, especially in the western part of the region of Ukraine, and even Communist Party members started to join. Although it wasn't dominant politically before 1991. It was a power, and it wasn't the only thing happening. It was not the only form of opposition to the Soviets. There was also minor strikes in the eastern part of the country. So a lot of opposition to the Soviet Union, a lot of popular mobilization. And then in 1991, when Gorbachev allowed popular referenda to take place across the country, across the Soviet Union, Ukrainian population voted for independence in very large numbers, which surprised a lot of the communist leaders, since they thought of Ukrainians very much as loyal to the Soviets. And then Soviet Union imploded at the end of 91, and Ukraine acquired independence. And Ukraine became a democracy. So I want to emphasize this. Since then, Ukraine has been a democracy. It's had a series of presidents. And it's also had not an easy history, shall we say. It's kind of had a series of difficult presidential elections, especially fast forwarding to 2004, when political leader Yushchenko was elected and unseated, had unseated Kuchma, who was a leader that was closer to the east. So before 2004, there had been kind of Ukrainian leaders that didn't really try to divide the country into east or west. But then you had a kind of situation where there was Yanukovych, who was a pro-Russian candidate, was supported by Putin. Putin was directly involved in this election and apparently poisoned Yushchenko, the opposition to Yanukovych. And Yanukovych narrowly won. And the election was falsified, so people took to the streets. This was the Orange Revolution, the first massive series of protests in which people protested against a falsified election, and they won. It led to the unseating of Yanukovych and putting in place of Yushchenko. So without getting into too much about what happened with Yushchenko's presidency, which kind of focused in a little bit on a more ethno-national kind of issues that were of mainly concern to many people in the western part of Ukraine, you can see that from Russia's point of view, there was, going back to this time, the beginning of Putin's presidency in 2000, a kind of understanding of Ukraine as reflecting the battles between the political elites. So the battles between political leaders, east and west, and it is the case that these political battles were kind of rooted in different regions. So there has been a degree of regional political polarization. But what was missed here, I think, is that That doesn't mean that there weren't these broader trends developing within the population in terms of loyalty to Ukraine, in terms of the development of civic identity among Ukrainian citizens, and just common ways of thinking about political issues that weren't necessarily about which politician they're going to vote for, or which or about the geopolitical orientation of the country, whether Ukraine would become oriented toward Russia or oriented toward Europe. Okay, so now fast forwarding to the crisis of 2013 and 2014, which is really critical to understand because it's really the beginning of this war. There was another election in there in which Yanukovych, the pro-Russian candidate, won and had been ruling. He was extremely corrupt and widely hated by, over time, increasingly so by the Ukrainian population. He had shrunk the Ukrainian elite to a small circle of his friends and his son's friends, so that he had become excessively wealthy. And you may have seen videos of his palace with his own private zoo and golden toilets and all of these, really disgusting waste of money. And yet Yanukovych, who had come from the eastern cities and was supported by a certain set of politicians there, was flirting, so to speak, with the West and with Europe. And the EU had been trying to get Ukraine to join the EU or be placed on the road toward joining the EU. And so Ukraine was about to sign what's called the association agreement with the EU at the same time that Russia was trying to pressure Ukraine to sign the relatively newly formed customs union, which was sort of like Russia's answer to the EU, an economic union of post-Soviet states, Armenia, Kazakhstan. But Putin really needed Ukraine for this customs union to work. And what happened was Yanukovych had agreed to join the association, the EU's association agreement, and then suddenly, enticed by basically a bribe by Russia, reversed his agreement. So this led to the massive kind of initially student protests in 2013 on the Maidan, on the main square in Kiev. And these protests just grew and grew, in part because it became violent. And eventually, I do have a slide about this. There's a slide, 2 slides there, if you can see them, Carlos, where you can see there's a stage and people protesting. They set up camps that went on for weeks and weeks and weeks through the beginning of 2014. And eventually Yanukovych decided to use snipers to kill protesters. So 100 Ukrainians died, and this brought out more people onto the streets. And the Maidan revolution, as it was called by Ukrainians, unfortunately became violent, and to the point where Yanukovych feared for his life, so he fled. Initially fled to Crimea and then to Russia, where he stays today, and a new government was ushered in. This government was not necessarily seen as legitimate by many parts of the population in Ukraine, and especially many parts of the population in the East, especially in cities of Donetsk and Luhansk. And as a result of what happened, there was this deep period of instability in 2014 in which first Russia annexed Crimea, one of the regions of Ukraine. And then there were battles within cities such as Kharkiv, Odessa in the south, Donetsk and Luhansk for control of the political establishment there. And this was a kind of battle between, battle between people who were not in favor of the new government. Then there were some Ukrainians on that side, but also Russia got involved and brought in and funded provocateurs to side with the anti-Maidan, anti-new government in Kiev side. So there was a lot of violence and instability during this period. And fast forwarding, basically, it led to this situation in which Russia funded provocateurs and military to take over and support the most extreme of these Ukrainian activists who not only opposed Maidan, but were demanding a degree of autonomy or even separatism. And this is how we have what became the war in Donbass. So the war in Donbass basically started when these protests in Donetsk, in the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk, became violent and the central administration buildings were taken over. Now, I've done research on the origins of the war, and it's very important to understand that only a minority of the population, according to the polls we have from right before the war in 2014, only a minority of the population, although a large minority, around 30%, supported what we would call separatism. And they didn't even know what that meant. Many of the Ukrainian citizens there just thought it meant like more autonomy for Donetsk and Luhansk. But it turns out that because of Russia's involvement and funding of weapons and the new Ukrainian government's decision in April and May to try to unseat these new separatist republics, or so-called self-styled republics, the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, that had declared themselves to exist with backing from Russia. So the Ukrainian military began to fight. Some paramilitary groups came over to fight in East Ukraine, and the Russian government supplied weapons, supplied even probably some soldiers, and the war in Donbass began. So this war is really instrumental to understanding, I think, why Putin felt like there was a lot of support in Eastern Ukraine. But he got it wrong. Even that was wrong. And at that time, Russia didn't go further. There was an expectation that maybe, there would be this massive uprising in the cities of Odessa and Kharkiv and Dnipro, all cities in the east, if you can see on the map, on one of the maps, that did have, some people who opposed Maidan. But opposing Maidan does not mean supporting Russia. It doesn't mean wanting to join Russia. It didn't mean at the time in 2014 not wanting to be part of Ukraine. So that's a point that is often missed, certainly by Russia, but has often been missed by many Ukrainians as well. And Russia didn't go further. It kind of, held back, and we had this kind of so-called line of contact established after the violent part of the war in 2015. We have the kind of OSCE entering and observing the Minsk Accords were signed, in which there was supposed to be a ceasefire. There was not exactly a ceasefire for the 8 years since then. But there was just kind of low-level kind of war maintained all along that line of contact, which is a tragedy for the people there. Uprooted, led to a million, more than a million IDPs. Some displaced people and war refugees went to Russia. Some went to other cities of Ukraine. So this war, basically has been one of the most important events in Eurasia, and unfortunately kind of fell off the radar screen of journalists around the world to a degree, but it should not have, because not only is it important for Ukraine and for the people of Ukraine, and it's been an enormous challenge for them to kind of figure out what to do, but as we can see, it was not a situation that Russia or Putin was willing to accept. And so probably since then, Putin had kind of nursed this idea that, there should not be an independent Ukraine, and that at least half the country, according to this myth of the polarized Ukraine, at least half the country would support being allied with or not part of Russia per se, but maybe a kind of frozen conflict or a land in between that's supportive of Russia. And the really interesting thing, so the polls show that that's not necessarily the case, because what we've seen since 2014 is that there's been increasing support away from Russia and toward joining NATO, even in eastern cities. Increasing support for joining the EU, even in the eastern cities. And there's also been, very interestingly, a growth in a kind of residual category of neither Europe nor Russia, people who don't want to be pulled between the two superpowers. And I also found this in my focus group conversations. So people don't want to be manipulated, they want to be independent, but they're always Ukrainian and they speak as Ukrainians. So this kind of misinterpretation, not being familiar with the actual public opinion in Ukraine, led to a massive miscalculation, in addition to the fact that social surveys were conducted by Russia's FSB, and which they found again that Zelensky's popularity was declining, that Ukrainians had very low trust in the Rada, the parliament, over time, and in political institutions in general. But those same surveys found that there was very high trust in the Ukrainian military, and that there was also high trust and growing trust in local and municipal governments. And so what they didn't expect is that people fight for their city, they fight for their country, and the growth in support for Ukrainian national identity meant something. And this was completely missed by the Kremlin. So I think I will just leave it there so that we have time for a Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elise, and thank you really for putting the current situation in context. I don't know, Carlo, do you have any questions from the audience? Do we see any?
Yes, we have a couple of questions in. I'll just read them out to you, Elise. Thank you so much for the really fascinating presentation. So we have one question here. What can we in the US do to help and support Ukrainian people?
Thank you for that. I happen to bring along some places you could donate. But I think, one thing I would say, I mean, I guess with permission, I think I could put those in the chat.
Please.
Right ahead.
Okay, thank you. With one thing I would say is to not forget about what's happening there, especially if this war grinds on, because Americans tend to forget or to lose focus when the next crisis comes along. And okay, so I'll try to put this in the chat. And Ukraine needs support to rebuild eventually, of course, and it will need the IDPs, the displaced, the war refugees in Europe will need support. There's many places. This is the first one. This is actually to help Ukrainians. I believe this one is to help Ukrainians who are trying to arrange cars. So it's the name of an individual who's taking money to help arrange cars to get people out of the cities that are now besieged or under attack and move them into Western Ukraine or into Europe. And then I'm going to put another New York-based organization which raises money for Ukraine, for humanitarian overtime, and has been raising money for a long time, since 2014, and is really experienced at it, and is run by my friend and colleague, and it's called Razom for Ukraine, and it's right here in New York City. So I think just paying attention to this, being aware of the danger for Europe and for the world, frankly, and not letting it, and not being so upset when Americans have to bear some economic costs, is just, I guess, what I would say Americans can do at this point.
Thanks so much for those links. And we have more questions coming in. One question here. Have you seen Kissinger's 2014 Washington Post piece arguing that Ukraine must be a buffer state and should not join NATO? Could you comment on this view, also articulated by Mearsheimer, Kennan, etc.?
Yeah, well, I think that ship has sailed. Also, I think it's not really the place of Western academics or even Kissinger to tell Ukrainian people and Ukrainian leaders what they should do. I understand maybe, it's coming from a kind of realist place in which we wanted to avoid just this outcome of Russia turning toward a more aggressive stance. So I understand why, I understand that kind of rational argument can make sense to many people. But at this point, it's hard to imagine that Ukraine, after weathering the destruction that it has, would agree to a neutrality. I mean, it may agree to a neutrality in the short term to stop the death and destruction, but I don't think that in the long term, given what it's going through and given the growing orientation toward Europe and toward democracy, that the people and leaders there would give up on democracy or would be interested in siding with Eurasia or Russia at this point.
Thanks. And I see some people have their hands up. If you could just type your question into the Q&A box, I will ask it. Another question here, how does this relate to what happened earlier this year in Kazakhstan?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It does relate because in a way, what we see there is if Zelensky had just rolled over. So there were a series of protests, and I'm not saying they're necessarily about joining the West or about democracy, but they were definitely about opposition to a corrupt regime, opposition to the same old leaders who'd been in power, who were tightly tied to Russia. And people rose up for a variety of reasons that we still have to work on to understand what they were. And instead, you see a new regime also tightly tied to Russia just take its place and repression of those protests. So this is the kind of outcome that Russia wants. Another former Soviet republic, now independent state, Kazakhstan, agreeing to remain within Russia's orbit. And allied with Russia. However, Kazakhstan, let's say, it still has a degree of geopolitical autonomy, and it hasn't not agreed to send troops to support what Russia's doing in Ukraine. So that Kazakhstan is an important country to watch.
Another question here, do you think this issue will affect other countries, specifically Balkan countries, as there have been major comparisons to former Yugoslavia?
Yeah, yes, another tragedy of the post-Cold War world, to put it mildly. Well, I think any country that has relations with Russia, and that includes the successor states to Yugoslavia and the Balkans, are carefully watching and trying to evaluate what their country's relationship to Russia and toward the EU will be moving forward. I mean, I think this is redefining European relations writ large. We can't even predict the consequences of this conflict, of this war. They will be so enormous. They definitely will redraw European relations. For the Balkans, I think the more immediate concerns, of course, would be whether Putin and Russia are interested in widening this war. Whether they are interested in like literally rolling back the post-1991 European security architecture. I'm not so sure that that's what Putin has in mind, but I also would not have predicted that Putin would have gone into Ukraine with this much force. But because of the special relationship that I've outlined and the misunderstanding that many Russian leaders have about Ukraine, I kind of see this as Ukraine as sui generis, kind of unique to, this could be another wrong prediction, but I kind of see this as unique to the understanding of Russia and this desperate need to not let Ukraine be free, as much as because it's a message to the population of Russia that there cannot be a population in a neighboring state that has a Maidan revolution in 2014, gets out there to support Europe and achieves that goal. The states of the Balkans and the states that are now part of NATO have already moved toward Europe and have already achieved that goal. So they're in a sort of a different place from the point of view of least Putin using those populations for domestic purposes. And I think for that reason and some others I don't necessarily expect armed aggression against former East European satellite states.
Thank you very much for that insightful answer. That's really fascinating. We have another question here. What is Putin's endgame at this point? How do we give him an out where he domestically saves face, or is Russian regime change the only viable outcome?
Okay, so there's a few questions there. The first is, what's Putin's endgame? And that's a very difficult question to answer at this time, because this has backfired so enormously for Russia, and it's not really clear, that this is ever going to be a war, or there's ever going to be an outcome that benefits Russia here. It can't be as a result of the sanctions, and even as a result of the increasing number of Russian soldiers who are dead, which is not something that the Russian population favors or can put up with. So I think we'll see growing opposition within Russia over time to this war, especially if they're able to get more information, because right now all they're seeing is what a lot of Russians know is that they think this is a military operation confined to Donetsk and Luhansk, to the DNR and the LNR, just a continuation of the 2014 war. They think it's a small scale thing. So there's okay. So yeah, and the other question is, should there be an out? That's a question for the diplomats. I think that I think it's important, because we don't want Putin to feel so cornered that he may escalate to use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine or against Europe. So I think the diplomats may be trying to work on an out, but such a complicated things are unfolding at such a rapid pace. Zelensky in Ukraine may decide they want an out too, because they're not willing to put up with just thousands and thousands of their population under siege or being destroyed by tactical nuclear weapons. And so I think many, many different issues are on the table. I know, Israel has recently gone to talk to Russia, and diplomats are working to the degree that they can to try to talk to Putin and to Zelensky.
And the last question there was about the possibility of regime change in Russia.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's a good one. We are Russian specialists. When I say we, I'm trying to again put this in the chat. So I think it's a possibility. I would not have said that regime change is likely at any point or for any reason, aside from what we see as what we are observing to be the consequences of this war, namely sanctions that actually bite, unlike the first set of sanctions that were imposed after 2014. And as a result of what I just mentioned, which would be large numbers of Russian soldiers dying. And as a result of the fact that a lot of Russians didn't want this war in the first place. They see Ukrainians as culturally similar to them and as, kind of within the Slavic family. And so just don't see why there should be a war and don't support the war. Although it should be said that many Russians do support the war, and not to excuse them for doing so. So over time, there could be growing opposition, but the goal of sanctions really is not just to move people onto the streets. The actual design of sanction is to divide the elite, to divide the leadership around Putin. And there, this is a trickier question. It has to do with the personal calculations of oligarchs and people who Putin have made very wealthy, as well as especially the security services. It doesn't look, judging by the expressions on the faces of some of the security services from photos we have in the past few weeks, that they are in favor of this war. But to move against Putin, is still a risk. And we even don't know what that would mean. It's not like the Russian security services are liberals, right? So what comes after Putin might be equally as bad or intransigent, just maybe without the destructive war, without the kind of self-defeating, irrational, dangerous war. So I would say that it's much higher regime change is a higher possibility than any Russia specialist would have predicted at any time since Putin became president in 2000.
Great. We have time for one more question. Thank you so much, everybody who sent them in. After Putin is no longer in power, regardless of the cause, do you see Russia becoming more democratic in the future, given the current sentiments of its younger generations?
Yeah, so this is a tricky question because it gets into generations and how political opinions shift over time among the same generation. Years ago, I naively would have endorsed the sentiment that the younger generation is more democratic. But what we see over time is just like continual disappointment by the young generation. I mean, remember the young generation existed, in 2000 when Putin took power and didn't really mobilize as he closed the political structure and removed democracy over the course of the first 7 to 10 years of his multiple and many presidencies. And then also, why do we see young people out on the streets? If you've seen images of Russians protesting, yes, the young generation may be perceived to be more liberal, and I'm sure that those out on the streets are, but some of them maybe are just against war. Like you don't have to be, pro-democracy to be against war. And then some of those young people are able to protest because they don't have children at home to take care of, so they can go to jail. Because now the consequence for protesting in Russia is a jail sentence. I mean, even the New York Times left Russia today. It's just shocking, like what we're seeing happen in Russia is a tragedy in its own right, in the sense not to be compared, of course, with what Ukraine is going through, but in the sense that, Putin is bringing the country back to the Soviet Union pre-Gorbachev, when you could not protest, you could not say the word war. It has to be a special military operation. So things there are shutting down. Russians are fleeing. So many members of the pro-democratic generation are fleeing to other post-Soviet states like Georgia, or even probably Kazakhstan, Russian-speaking places, or the West. And so it's a bit tricky to say what happens to people when they get older. And some data have shown that people's opinions shift, not that they become like raging conservatives, but that they start to view things in a different way when they have responsibilities, taking care of their elders and their older generation, or taking care of children. So it's a tricky question, and it's hard to pin our hopes on change coming from a new generation, especially when they're subject to so much propaganda, and when they're educated and kind of brought through a set of institutions that are so illiberal inside the Russian state.
Thank you, Elise, for this really presentation. It's given us a lot of food for thought. And we all hope for peace in the coming days and hope that the UN can bring about a peaceful resolution. So, Carlo, can you put on our ending pieces? Yes, if you wanted to join UNA New York, you can do that by going on our website, UNA-NYC.org. We would love to have you. And our next event is March 16th at 1 p.m. Seems like we all forgotten about COVID, but we do have a presentation on that day and hope you can come. So thank you everyone for attending tonight. And Elise, thank you. And Carlo, thanks for your help again. And have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for your attention to this issue. Thank you for coming tonight, everyone.